Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. We're recording this on January 12th, 2017, and you're listening to episode 15. Politicoast is a podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and around the country. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticoastPod.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. Happy 2017. I mean, this year can't be that much worse than the last one. We recorded a whole roundup episode that I encourage people to listen to find out what happened last year if you aren't aware, and some of our predictions for this year. But already there's been a lot of shit going down in the United States. And everyone who thought Trump was going to sort of calm down and be more presidential following the election are, sort of beyond a doubt dead wrong. And so there's that whole, we've called it a tire fire, but calling it a tire fire is insulting to tire fires. And we could go into that.
Yeah, when Russia is probably influencing the next president of the United States, I think we've gone past the point of tire fire into outright disaster.
And so there's that, and we could do probably a whole show or more just venting and making golden shower jokes and then getting into the more serious stuff like you mentioned. But I trust there's a lot of podcasts right now that are going to do that. So I'm thinking let's start this year on a slightly different note and delve into the more domestic stories that have come up, at least in the last week. The first big one of which is Trudeau's done his cabinet shuffle like was widely predicted over the holidays. This was announced just in the last week. The biggest headlines, of course, were that Chrystia Freeland has been moved out of international trade and into foreign affairs. Stéphane Dion sort of taking a step out of politics, almost moving more into the
elder statesman role?
Yeah, and the sort of becoming an ambassador to Germany and to the European Union. And the same goes for John McCallum, another long-time stalwart liberal. It's almost the sort of old guard is trickling away, and now it's, the Trudeau Liberals are really in prominence. The other big sort of news out of this was that Maryam Monsef, who you wanted to see leave Democratic Reform, has been pushed out of Democratic Reform. She has been given status of women, which some have called a demotion, but that could be a bit insulting to the status of women ministerial shit.
It's definitely a lower profile portfolio, especially in the aftermath of the election, where the electoral reform thing was just a huge part of the election platform. It was something everyone was watching going into it. So just in terms of what's been on the government's radar and everyone's radar, it's definitely less in the limelight. So arguably it's a promotion, but you're still a minister at that point. And the demotion I wanted to see was to the backbenches.
I guess it's the sort of question of, was the mishandling on her, or was she just doing, following the orders? Like, someone had to take the heat. And from what I've heard, it's not that she's an incapable politician entirely. She definitely made mistakes in the last term with some of the specific things she said and, ways she fumbled the file. But maybe she can handle status of women better. Of course, into the Democratic Reform position comes Karina Gould, who everyone then had to Google, who is this MP? And no offense to Ms. Gould. She's 29, first elected in the fall, and there's not much else to say about her. She's got sort of a, pre-politics activism role.
BA in political science and MA in international relations. So not completely out of her wheelhouse, but at the same time, not a huge heavy hitter and with, a big track record on this. Rookie MP, nothing, that indicates this is a file the government is taking really seriously. Everyone was really watching to see whether Stéphane Dion would get moved to Democratic Reform, because he's done a lot of work on it in the past, and that would have been a clear and unambiguous signal that the government was taking this seriously and actually really wanted to make progress on it, and, well, that's clearly not happened.
Yeah, they replaced the youngest person in cabinet with someone younger, and not to be ageist about it, Karina's only a year or two younger than I am, but she doesn't have that political experience, at least to say on this issue, where the Conservatives and the NDP have put forward their strongest MPs to really move this issue forward, you have the Liberals sort of continuing to go to the rookies, the sort of minor leagues almost, and say, well, here, you'll figure it out. And if they want to get it done, you're right, they need someone with the experience, I think.
Yeah, or even just somebody has a track record on this file. Yeah, our local MP, Joyce Murray, has previously run in the past leadership campaign on a platform of electoral reform. You also have Anita Vandenbeld, who's worked in international development for the UN, including on democratic issues, and, that's a strong background there. I mean, both of them are currently languishing in the backbenches when they're putting a rookie MP forward on this file who doesn't have a strong track record on it, or even a track record at all, which definitely indicates that this isn't something they're taking seriously.
I think Gould has spoken a couple times on electoral reform. She has made statements that she wants to see the system changed. And I did hear, I think it was on the Pollcast, that her master's thesis or her senior thesis in university was on electoral systems. So I think she understands electoral systems. That doesn't mean she can say which one we should go to. And maybe that's what Trudeau wanted, is just someone who doesn't have baggage. But at this point, they need to stop consulting. Like, there's still another 3 days for that mydemocracy.ca survey, if we'll call it that, to be filled out. And I know that because I'm getting Facebook ads on it. So that means our government is kindly enough paying to shove that survey down our throats. I'll give Gould the benefit of the doubt. I imagine she's going to try hard. I hope she manages to do better than Monsef.
Well, it's not hard.
It's going to be tough. And it's disappointing not to see someone with the experience and the political knowledge to steer this through.
It's disappointing that today she declined to endorse the promise the Liberals had made in the election of fully replacing the electoral system. So it's not a promising sign based on what we've seen so far on this file.
On the more promising side, the one thing I did see was Nathan Cullen put forward a new proposal. And I remember the last big proposal he had was when they formed the committee to make the committee relate to the popular vote rather than to the number of seats in Commons. And his new proposal is to co-write the bill that the Liberals want to bring forward with them. So rather than just have the government push forward its own vision of what it thinks the committee meant, to co-author that and have it be a party consensus. We'll see if they fumble that as well and go no before saying yes, or if they just sort of ignore him. But I thought it was an interesting idea, like Nathan Cullen's good at.
Yeah, that's one thing I'm actually going to be watching for, is kind of what sort of tactician is Gould. Mary Monsef kind of had Cullen run around her and basically out of her lead on kind of dealing with the tactical aspects of the politics of this file. And it's going to be interesting to see whether the new minister is going to be able to keep up with Nathan Cullen on this.
Well, let's come back to Chrystia Freeland. I think her record at international trade is seen two different ways. On the sort of very partisan conservative side, I think they have a lot of negative things to say about her. And I think we criticized her when we were talking about the Wallonia controversy, but it turns out she did manage to solve that. And in the end, I think the fair characteristic is that she actually did pretty well in international trade for the global climate that has turned anti-trade.
Yeah, she's definitely shown herself to be one of the strongest performers of the new cabinet. As you said, did really well on the CETA negotiations with Wallonia, pushed that through. It looked like it was dead in the water, and she gets some serious credit for that. And I think it's just a solid move on the Liberals' part to put her front and center on the international file. And Dion was never a great fit for foreign minister. He's not much of a diplomat, just really not a good match between kind of his personality and what's required for the job.
Well, from what I heard about Dion in the role, and just Dion in any role, he's a good behind-the-scenes policy guy. And I think on some specific issues, he was definitely at work doing a lot of the groundwork and the legwork. And on issues like dealing with Saudi Arabia. He's not ever going to be the person who stands up and denounces them in the firmest of language, but he's making the calls and doing some of that diplomacy that's necessary to, free diplomatic prisoners. But of course, he probably gets tired of politics, and an ambassadorship is probably a nice fit for him.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, and Freeland is a sort of contrast to that, though.
Yes.
Where Dion's more in the background, Freeland's got the more in your face. She did a lot of public appearances on US TV even in the last year.
During the negotiations in Belgium for the CETA deal, she came out, did a few media appearances based with the message of, hey, if you can't figure out a deal with Canada, who can you figure out a deal with? And a lot of those kind of more public, push the political buttons and try and bring people around on the public face of it, it's definitely more her strong suit. And I think that's going to be an important skill set going forward as the case has to be made stronger and stronger these days on a lot of these important issues. 10 years ago, you could basically assume everyone was going to be on side on a lot of these ones, and that's not necessarily the case anymore. And while there was going to be, a little back and forth on, is this deal good for this country or whatever, the basic consensus was definitely towards increased global cooperation, increasing trade ties, and that's just not a safe assumption anymore. So having somebody who is that kind of really effective public communicator out on the forefront is a smart move on this, because you have to sell an increasingly skeptical public and politicians on these issues. So that's definitely a good pick on Trudeau's part for that. It's also very interesting in terms of the signals that her appointments send. She's generally regarded as very effective based off her performance in the first year, but strongly hawkish on Russia. Previously lived in Russia, speaks the language fluently, and has a good grasp of the situation there, but at the same time strongly anti-Putin, and is in fact one of the few people who is currently actually banned from traveling to Russia as their counter-sanctions to our sanctions after the Ukraine involvement and incidents surrounding Russia. The Russians have said they're not going to bat down on that, but it definitely sends a strong signal to Russia and also to the new Trump administration that Canada's content to walk its own path on certain things, including Russia, and with McCallum's appointment to an ambassadorship in China, high-profile former cabinet minister, that's also a signal that, we're going to be making some more conciliatory approaches to China than Trump's going to be doing.
It's good that the front bench has shown that it has some talent. It'll be interesting to see with this shuffle and this other sort of positions that I don't think we need to go into too deeply, but to see if the bench can be deep enough to actually have a talent to replace Freeland, who needs to step up to almost like a deputy prime ministership level of prominence she sort of gets with this at this time of global politics.
Yeah, overall, I think this was a broadly successful cabinet shuffle for Trudeau, probably a 4 out of 5, if I was to rank it. The only kind of down spot on here is that Mary Monsef's still in cabinet, and they couldn't find a way to quietly shuffle her to the back like they've done with a few other cabinet ministers who've had problems.
While we're on the topic of Trudeau, he went on vacation over Christmas. I myself went to Cancun, which was lovely. I got to snorkel with turtles. Trudeau had, I guess, a slightly better vacation in the Bahamas with the Aga Khan, apparently.
Yeah, so this has actually been kind of an interesting story to follow, because it first got picked up by Dave Aiken at Post Media, wanting to know why nobody would tell him where the Prime Minister was. When that started to surface, I was more or less thinking this is kind of overblown, not much is happening here. Yeah, the PM can have his vacation, it's not really an issue. As long as the government knows how to reach him in an emergency, it's not a problem. Of course, since then, we've been getting little trickles of information, and the fact that it was kept secret and where he went starting to get a little more dicey. So as you mentioned, he went and stayed with the Aga Khan on his private island. The Aga Khan's hereditary royalty, and is currently the Imam of the Ismaili Islam sect, and also a friend of the family of Trudeau, big business leader, philanthropist, runs a major international development organization that's generally perceived to be a very well-run, positive organization, ranked very highly by Charity Navigator, and just all around, everyone basically agrees he's a good guy. Like, his previous government gave a bunch of grants to him, made him an honorary citizen. Like, there's really a broad consensus here that the Khan overall is, pretty above board, solid guy. But as I was saying, he runs this organization, and it currently receives federal government money. Currently $55 million over 5 years. That was a decision of this current government. And the organization's Canadian branch has also registered to lobby the federal government, which is why this gets a little dicey, in that Trudeau essentially accepted the gift of a luxury vacation on a private island from an individual who's runs an organization that both receives federal money and is registered as a lobbying organization. And that gets pretty awkward on a lot of ethical issues. I saw a back of the envelope calculation that this is going to range somewhere in the high tens of thousands to low hundred thousands in terms of what the fair market value to rent a private island for a week or so would be. It's probably a little more actually over the holidays, but you get the idea. The market value of this is pretty big, and it definitely raises some serious ethical red flags on why the Prime Minister is accepting such a gift.
So Andrew Scheer, one of the dozen or so or more Conservative Party leadership candidates, called for an investigation into this. He asked the Ethics Commissioner to look into it, and they're now considering it. And this also looks at the Conflict of Interest Act. And like you say, there's strong and good limitations in Canada on how much money lobbyists can use to try to influence government, whether it's through gifts and things like that. And this would be, if this was a pure, cash gift to, say, give our foundation money, it would clearly violate those rules. But it gets fuzzier because there are exemptions in there. Prime ministers have friends. Friends are allowed to give friends gifts. Like, my birthday's coming up. We just had Christmas. You can give gifts for these kind of things, as so long as there's no expectation. And that's where the question marks sit. And that's why it's unclear and cloudy. And following months and almost a year of these sort of cash for access scandals and controversies that the Conservative Party has been just chipping away at slowly until they're really starting to make a big dollar sign of marble or something, it doesn't look good. And that's sort of where it's at. The Prime Minister has paid back the cost of the flight, so whereas he initially had it as a gift, he's now paid for it, but that's not what matters. What matters was that initial incident and whether it...
And just to be clear, it's that the flights were covered, as the standard practice is prime ministers, they can't fly commercial, so they reimburse the government for basically an equivalent ticket price on a commercial jet. So it does cost the government a little more than they get back from the prime minister whenever he goes somewhere, but it's a reasonable compromise. But he has only reimbursed the government for their use of the jet to get him to the Bahamas. He hasn't reimbursed for the market value of the vacation from the Khan, nor from the use of the private helicopter, which we'll be getting to in a moment. But yeah, as you said, the Conflict of Interest Act does have an exception for gifts from friends and family. Now, it would seem to me the spirit of this act is, as mentioned, to, hey, it's Christmas time, we're old friends, here's a gift, whatever. We don't want every MP to have the ethics commissioner doing an inventory of their Christmas gifts from everybody they know. And that's reasonable, but at the same time, it doesn't seem like such a big gift would be kind of part of the intent of this law in terms of excluding from the Conflict of Interest Act. The real question this raises is is there any indication this is going to influence the Prime Minister and his future decisions? Which is kind of really the underlying intent of the act, and where this gets a little fuzzier. At the very least, this showed poor judgment on the Prime Minister's part. Whether or not the gift technically is illegal or not, still a bit of an open question, but I think we can both agree that horrible judgment on his part, and he probably should have turned this down, if for no other reason than the optics, and especially because he potentially has violated the Conflict of Interest Act.
Well, and I was thinking about this exact kind of question leading up to this discussion, and you have to remember, Trudeau was born pretty much with that silver spoon in his mouth, and so he's just used to this kind of lifestyle. We keep forgetting during the election, he sort of tried to play himself as the down-to-earth, everyone, friends with everyone. But he is more like a celebrity. He comes from that sort of an upper class most of us don't know, and we don't even realize Canada has. So the idea of a Christmas trip to the Bahamas on a private island is foreign to most of us. I said I went to, an all-inclusive in Cancun, but that's sort of a special treat that I can do once in a while through help of in-laws. The Prime Minister can do that on a whim because his family is wealthy and has prestige and has these connections. I'm not going to get invited by the Aga Khan to come to his island and party or whatever they do. It's a different lifestyle, and so these mistakes are going to get made, and that doesn't make it okay. But it's how I think it comes about. He just goes, well, this is just what I've always done. And then he ends up putting his foot in it again.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point here, and it's something I've considered as well. And there was some, not a huge amount from the campaign, but some attention paid and focus on how his upbringing at 24 Sussex could, it's a bit of an asset and whatnot, but what wasn't really talked about was how it's a liability in some cases. And I think this and the Castro eulogy, I think, are two examples where the Prime Minister isn't necessarily approaching this from the same way everyone else is. And these kind of personal relationships, well, they can be useful at times in acting the business of the state. They can also cause problems when the Prime Minister acts in a way that's, made sense from that personal relationship point of view, but isn't really how a Prime Minister is supposed to act.
Well, it'll be tough to see if this story kind of sticks. I mean, I didn't follow it very closely when it first, but I guess it had that sort of slow trickle in, and there were a lot of other things going on at the same time.
It's still trickling in as we speak today. We've had last 2 days. There's been two new breaking bits of this. One is that it wasn't just Trudeau that went with them. Liberal MP Seamus O'Regan and the president of the Liberal Party were also on that trip, which definitely, I think, undercuts Trudeau's defense that this is just a visit to a family friend. If it's a visit to the family friend, why are you bringing the president of the Liberal Party, whose sole job is partisan politics?
People take vacations. I'm sure Trudeau's legitimately friends with both of those people, but you're absolutely right. It raises more questions that there aren't good answers for, which is what a good politician should be thinking of before he gets into this.
Yeah, and we talked about how the Prime Minister probably okay, possibly, because of the exception for gifts from friends. But as far as I know, neither of these two individuals are friends with the Aga Khan. So it raises issues there. And why didn't, they protest or raise issues with this? And the other bit of breaking news that came out today was that the Prime Minister got to the island via the Khan's private helicopter, which there's another section of Conflict of Interest that requires that ministers of the Crown do not travel on private aircraft unless it's an exceptional circumstance or has been cleared with the Ethics Commissioner.
Well, Christmas is a special time of year. It's not a arguably exceptional time of year, and even going to the Bahamas is something you would plan out, and you would hopefully plan out enough that you could ask the Ethics Commissioner, is this above board?
Yeah, it seems to be the sort of thing that somebody should have noticed. Surely they must have had the conversation before they got to the Bahamas, if for no other reason than the RCMP security detail and asking them how they're getting to the island. So this should have been a red flag ahead of time. They should have had time to clear with the ethics commissioner. And besides, I mean, the ethics commissioner, that's a senior government figure. They're going to be generally someone on their staff will know how to reach them. They're going to take the call from the prime minister if there's an issue. Like, he could have reached out. And it seems to me exceptional circumstances are kind of there to cover cases where you really have to travel now and you can't get a hold of the ethics commissioner, and going on a Christmas vacation that you've known about for a while doesn't really seem to qualify on either of those.
Yeah. If you need to evacuate somewhere or quickly fly to a funeral or something like that, those are exceptional. Christmas holidays is almost mundane.
In fact, I'd go beyond almost mundane and is incredibly mundane and should have been the thing that they would have cleared in advance. And the fact that they haven't cleared it in advance, I think, is a serious concern here, because at the very least, it shows terrible judgment that nobody in the PMO, the MP that went with him, the Liberal Party president, Trudeau himself,
and their families.
Yeah. And the Aga Khan, frankly. Like, he should have been aware how bad this looks, especially considering he's getting money from the federal government. Like, across the board, this was a complete lapse of judgment.
Maybe they hoped no one would find out, and that's why they weren't talking to the media ahead of time.
Have they not met the media? Like, somebody's going to ask this, and, that's exactly what happened. Dave Aiken, asked where the Prime Minister was, and when he didn't get an answer, he started digging, and this whole thing got unearthed. And the fact that they didn't tell anyone just makes the whole thing look worse. If Trudeau could come back and point to a file at the Ethics Commissioner's office and be like, hey, yeah, we reported it, and whatever, yeah, we didn't tell the media, but, we have it on file, we got clearance ahead, it's at that point, it's no big deal. It becomes, the Prime Minister wanted some privacy for a week, rather than the Prime Minister's, going on luxury vacations paid for by people who receive government money. Yeah, it's definitely something we're going to keep an eye on. And that's kind of where I'm actually most curious about this, is where is it going to go? Is this going to do lasting damage to the Trudeau government and the Trudeau brand? It's, on one hand, it really plays into that same sort of narrative the Conservatives have been trying to build, and I think this will definitely do that. On the other hand, it's a little hard to get people worked up over a philanthropist like the Khan, so it's a little hard to see. I mean, it could go either way, but I think having an ongoing ethics investigation at the very least is going to be kind of a stone around the neck of the Prime Minister and the whole issue with this. And while the gift thing may be okay, I think, flying Con Air might be a bit of a problem.
Yeah, I don't see this hurting the Khan's reputation or the Khan Foundation. They do good work, and the fact that he hobnobs with the Prime Minister over Christmas, if anything's probably going to benefit him a bit. Trudeau's still pretty popular. It's Trudeau and the Liberal Party where the questions get raised. I don't think this is going to be the issue that ends the honeymoon, if the honeymoon is still going, but it's going to sort of chip away, and it's another chisel.
Yeah, I think it's going to be one of those things that it's not always those big scandals that bring people down. It's that slow build of issues, The
death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah. The last government, a huge part of the reason it lost was it's kind of perceived as a pretty nasty government. And there's no kind of one thing that really set it off. And, all the little kind of dirty tricks weren't really much of an issue until suddenly they were. Mm-hmm. And I think that could be the case here. And I think the worst part of this, probably, at least in terms of the overall good, bad outcomes thing, is the biggest downside is probably actually for the Khan's organization, is rather than being, oh, hey, this is a great philanthropy organization that, hey, everybody agrees, we should probably be doing a little bit to fund them and help them out. It's now become a political football. It's potentially politically toxic. I'm not necessarily sure if it's gone that far, but it's definitely harder to do anything around. And yeah, if nothing happens over the rest of Trudeau's term with respect to them, it's probably fine. But at the same time, if they get a bunch more grant money while he's suddenly that vacation, and whether or not that's gift of a friend, that's suddenly starts to look a lot more like influence peddling, and that becomes a big issue. So that's actually, I think, what's should be one of the long-term damages here is taking what was a good organization that everybody agreed was worth supporting and turning it into something that nobody wants to touch, or at least until there's a change in government.
Well, here in BC this week, we had another step forward towards the expansion of the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline. The government of BC has sort of green-lighted the provincial environmental approval process that we had to go through. The BC government couldn't just piggyback on the NEB's process, which has been criticized, but they did their own assessment, and on top of the 150-odd conditions the federal government put on at the end of the year, there's about another 25 or 27 conditions that the BC government is now putting onto this pipeline before it can be built, none of which seem to be overly onerous or going to damage or block the project. Christy Clark is also now saying that all of her 5 conditions for the approval of this pipeline have been met. Specifically, the biggest one being that she's reached a deal with Kinder Morgan where over the next 20 years, the company will give $50 million a year to the province as a sort of payment for going through the province. This is sort of unprecedented almost. Most pipelines get built and there's the job creation for the province that it goes through at the time and a little bit of maintenance ongoing. But there's not a lot of long-term economic gain for having a pipeline cut through your province. The main driver to do it is federalism and the idea that we're a country where resources need to get around, and so we need to all work together to make sure this goes. But this is, I guess, a win for Christy Clark to get not a ton of money, but some significant money, I think, from one specific project. And it's something that Rachel Notley in Alberta said, it's not going to set a big precedent. It's good for BC. She's just happy the pipeline's going ahead. And so that's where it's at right now.
Yeah, this is something that I've seen a bit of criticism on from your kind of hardcore federalists in the big, separation of powers between the federal government and the provinces. Some of them aren't too happy with the precedential value of this in terms of provincial government essentially extracting a toll from a national project going through their province. And yeah, I think that's actually probably a pretty solid criticism of the whole thing. Though, I mean, in theory, this is going to be kind of squirreled away in a spill response fund, so we're going to kind of have to see how that plays out. But considering the fungible nature of money and how government budgets tend to kind of slosh that around a bit, I'm going to be a little skeptical until I actually see the implementation of it.
Yeah, this is definitely the kind of deal I can just imagine Quebec politicians drooling over, the idea of, well, something has to go through us, let's just get paid or extract a good deal for it. And if we can get it here in BC, why can't they get it there? And it might make future national projects a little bit harder. Or maybe these deals will help actually bring the country together if the projects then all have to agree that every province has to benefit. I don't know. It's interesting. The other criticism, of course, is from the environmentalists, the Greens, and so forth, where they're opposed to the project no matter what. They don't see this as being in any way environmentally sustainable because it means more oil going from the oil sands to markets. It has a risk of spilling very thick bitumen into the Burrard Inlet here, which would be hard to impossible to clean up. And so there are legitimate fears there. Christy Clark has said one of her conditions was the spill response, and details of that are still sort of trickling out. It's really all up in the air and almost meaningless, essentially, politics, because with the election coming up, if the NDP comes in, they could throw up 10 new barriers that make this project impossible to get through. If the Greens miraculously become the government, they can do whatever else beyond that to make it even harder.
Yeah, this is definitely kind of staking out the early position before the election on it, where, a tentative support, but with enough kind of, hey, we're trying to get as many environmental restrictions on this as we can, or at least that's how the government's going to be presenting this. That's kind of going to show up their position going into the election, and that's where they want to fight. I'm not really sure any of the parties really want, except maybe the Greens, really want to fight on pipelines. For them, they have just a solid position on that's really kind of not going to get them dislodged at all and just really kind of true to their core identity. The NDP, as we've mentioned a few times, doesn't necessarily have that degree of unity, and I think the Liberals are worried that they're going to kind of lose that lower mainland support that they do have from this. And if there are definitely a lot of places around here that aren't too thrilled with the idea of the pipeline, so they're trying to weave that needle between, getting the support for the kind of economic development, we want it, people, and we don't want the pipeline because we're concerned about the risks, people, and they're trying to thread that needle fairly tightly, and it's going to be interesting to see whether they manage to succeed on doing that. Regarding the climate change thing, at least I've said I'm not a huge fan of going after pipelines as the approach to it. I don't think it's a particularly effective one, but it does seem to be where everybody else is kind of focusing on it, even if I think it's probably not the best way to go about it. And a couple economists have put forward suggesting that it's basically roughly an equivalent of a $200 a ton cost in terms of lost economic productivity versus the $50 to $150 cost that the various carbon tax proposals put it in. So it's going to be interesting to see on that.
And of course, there's also a growing number of court cases and lawsuits from municipalities and First Nations groups and environmentalists challenging this project. So that'll mean we absolutely won't see it being built for a while now. And of course, we're probably going to start to see protests as things start to ramp up towards the election, as things start to ramp up in terms of what comes next on this. There's a lot of talk about how the protests will go. Will it be one where people have to get rounded up and arrested? Will it be one where everything stays peaceful? And
Elizabeth May's already promised to get arrested.
Well, the one thing I think everyone has agreed is that the protests won't change anyone's mind.
Yeah, at this point, I don't think you're going to actually see a lot of people changing their mind on it. Pipelines have been such an issue for so long. There aren't a huge amount of undecideds on this, and those that are undecided probably aren't going to suddenly become strong supporters of one position or the other. So now it's the question isn't so much winning people over, but getting the right collection of people to kind of come around and build in the coalition of supporters of whatever your position is rather than kind of changing people's minds.
Well, and I think the key goal for the protests will be to really hammer the NDP and to really, because the Greens have their position, the Liberals have their position, the BC Liberals are definitely in favor of the pipeline, but it's that sort of NDP the NDP brass that's trying to decide between the economics of should we bring this through for jobs and whatnot, and the environmental risks, as it were. And if the protests can really hammer on the sort of limitations of the job prospects to BC and hammer on those environmental risks, they can potentially cement the NDP's opposition. They are opposed, let's be honest. John Horgan has said he's opposed to this pipeline, but they can take that from how Adrian Dix was opposed to pipelines before he was in favor of them and make sure there's not that sort of same level of flip-flop.
Yeah, for sure. The only question is that going to cost the NDP on that blue-collar vote that's looking for the construction jobs that come with the pipeline? And it also doesn't help that the only NDP government is in Alberta pushing for this. You get a bit of that inter-party troubles. And one of the reasons why, at least in my opinion, it's a bad idea to kind of have these same parties at different levels of government or in different provinces to be so closely affiliated the way the NDP model is. It leads to some really awkward positions where the party is pitted against itself, where having some separation, like the federal Liberals do from both like BC Liberals and the Ontario Liberals, where they're separate parties and a fair bit of overlap in there. Like a lot of the Queen Park Liberal staffers ended up moving to Ottawa when Trudeau came in, but there's that enough of a gap there, and they're separate parties that they can distance themselves without causing friction when there's a need to politically.
Well, people have thought that the sort of Alberta NDP for a while have been at risk of breaking off and becoming their own just because of their differences with the sort of federal NDP and with BC. And Alberta is a province where I think every political party except the NDP has broken away and potentially even been like the first to break away, like the first Conservatives to break away and the first Liberals to break away, just because Alberta's a little bit different, but we'll have to see where it goes. Let's run quickly through a few more stories that have come up because it's been just that kind of week. And we also haven't done a show since the end of the last year. You published a blog last week looking at whether Canada's poised to go into a fiscal crisis as our deficit is projected to continue until 2055.
Yeah, so last week the Toronto Sun released an article with the doom and gloom headline that a Barrie government report reveals a looming fiscal crisis. That's referring to the report the Department of Finance released update of long-term economic and fiscal projections. And that was released on the 23rd, but, everybody was on holidays and, nobody pores over government economics reports.
Apparently, except Toronto Sun writers.
Yeah, and even they waited till 2 weeks after it was released. So the short version is that they've done a bit of an update on their models, tweaked a few things, adjusted some new variables, and the deficit's projected to remain until 2055. And, naturally everybody kind of from the center on rightward was in a panic over this looming crisis. A lot of them still remember the 90s and the problems that came with that. The truth is, it's actually not such a big deal. The biggest change here was what's going to happen in the next 5 years. So what happened was short-term projections are based off an average of the private sector reports. And they got a little bit worse in their outlook. So you're going to have a slightly higher deficit. It's going to take a little longer to go away than before. So that was the big change here. The projected out to long term is more or less the same as before. But this is based off if you keep everything the same, program commitments, everything, and just kind of change all your revenues and outputs based off of the same programs, but changing demographics and projected economic growth. If we're taking in, I think it's roughly 14.5% of GDP in government revenues, we'll be taking roughly 14.5% of GDP in government revenues in 2055. So this is what happens if you do as Trudeau infamously suggests and let the budget balance itself. Basically run out the whole thing as planned right now. And nobody seriously expects the government to run its exact same programs 2055. So, yeah, the huge amount of doom and gloom, we're almost certainly going to have a conservative government in between there who will try and balance the budget at some point. The Liberals might decide to try and balance the budget quicker than that. You basically can't assume this is going to be going forward with any kind of real certainty past the next couple of years. And even so, as the deficit's going out there, your debt to GDP kind of peaks in the 2018-2019 fiscal year and drops off significantly. So between future government changes and a slowly declining debt to GDP ratio, which is still only in the 30s, and that's a pretty healthy number for it, things are overall not too bad, at least as far as the federal government is concerned.
And we'll put a link to your full blog up on the show notes, and it's on our website, politicos.ca.
Yes. I'll just mention a couple other things about this. Is that, of course, everybody's running on about how terrible it is, and that is one thing we're going to have to see is so far Trudeau's managed to do reasonably well with going against kind of the conventional wisdom since the 90s on deficits. And, we've probably moved far enough away from that time that it's, less in people's minds that, you really got to keep the deficit under control. So that, I think, is a long-term concern, is whether or not people are going to kind of underestimate the cost of deficits due to the fact that it's, just not as recent. And, the recency bias where people kind of overvalue kind of the recent events. And in this case, we've had a pretty stable fiscal situation, even through the recession and everything. And that wasn't the case 25 years ago. And because of that this has become the recent normal. I'm at least a little concerned that there's going to be a tendency to be more accepting of long-term deficits just because there's a bit of that political culture change.
Well, if they can keep close to that forecast, things will slowly improve and the economy will grow faster than the debt, which is an important thing to keep in mind because as the economy grows bigger, it means, our deficit or our debt isn't as big of a proportion. It's less of an issue. Even though it's still growing, like we still owe more and more each year, as a proportion of how much money we have, we're doing fine.
Yeah, it's the debt to GDP ratio that what economists really look at, and that's kind of the thing that's considered to be the better barometer than just what the big number of the absolute value of the debt is. And as I was saying, we're at a pretty good federal level of 31% right now. My bigger concern, and this is what's outside of the scope of this report, but I do talk about in the blog posts a fair bit, is we're looking at the federal books here, not the national books. And nationally, we're at 91% when you factor in the provinces. And they're the ones that's going to be bearing the brunt of the increased social costs in the next 20 years as the population ages. And that, I think, is going to be the longer term concern here. Isn't the feds going broke? It's going to be one of the provinces and what happens then.
Great. Next little story is the Globe and Mail uncovered sort of report on a number of focus groups the Liberals have been doing across the country, testing different ideas, one of which was most notably a sort of Netflix tax, an idea that we should be taxing money to help pay for Canadian content. A lot of these issues were along that sort of Canadian content ideas. Others were more around technology and innovation, so things like driverless cars or drones delivering packages. And then there's some talk about privatizing airports and seaports. So a lot of things that are actually pretty controversial if they were just sort of dropped in a omnibus bill or whatever. But it's interesting to see that they're sort of testing the water, and it's not clear if they're committing to any of these policies or just curious.
Yeah, for sure. This is definitely more of a test in the water, but it's a hint of where the party would like to go in the upcoming budget and kind of what new policies we're likely to see. In terms of the Netflix tax and the smartphone app they are looking at, these are generally related to the cultural content aspects that are currently under review by the federal government. There's a few different things they looked at, but you'd be looking at one proposal was a voluntary $2 contribution on top of a Netflix bill. They didn't mention what the non-voluntary tax was, but it's probably maybe half that or something, and that's still, 10% of a Netflix bill right there, easily. And I could see this getting a fair bit of pushback.
I know there's been a lot of discussion about Canadian content. It's one of their big consultations ongoing right now, and Canada Land's done a lot of good coverage of this. Part of the problem has been, as media has shifted from television and radio to internet and podcasts, there aren't the same requirements that a certain amount of media be CanCon. Unfortunately, the rules of what CanCon is are also getting fuzzier. And so it's not a matter of just necessarily filming it in Vancouver or Toronto or in Canada or having Canadians work on it. You have to meet certain bars, and sometimes things you would think are Canadian aren't, and some things that you wouldn't think of as Canadian are. And this sort of arbitrariness is what they're hoping to flesh out, at least with the consultation, and going into this sort of policy testing. It's how do we ensure that Netflix is producing Canadian content if they're going to be here, and is that important? And I think the broader question we should even be asking is, in our sort of post-national multicultural society, what does Canadian content look like? Should we just be making sure that the Canadian media scene is alive and healthy? Or should we be subsidizing newspapers and arts projects for CBC?
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, there's definitely some good work that can be done to simplify the regulations, because they're a massive mess. In terms of making, requirements to have certain amounts of content be Canadian and whatnot, that gets significantly, at least in my opinion, less justifiable, especially the on-demand models that we currently have. 10 hours of YouTube content gets uploaded every second, roughly, to YouTube. There is literally more media content out there than anyone can consume. This is not a choice-limited situation that the media landscape was back when the CanCon rules were put in place. And we spent, a couple $100 to buy a long-term SoundCloud account, a microphone, and our startup costs were minor. There's some good stuff being put out on YouTube by Canadians and whatnot. Startup costs are also really low. It doesn't really make a huge amount of sense to start requiring all these services to host this stuff because Canadian content just isn't in limited supply. It's never been more accessible. And rather than this kind of weird protectionist response, we should be looking at, exporting it, if anything. The bigger problem with Canadian content, in my opinion, is most of it tends to be pretty crappy. And, I can't remember the last time I actually watched a CBC show that wasn't kind of news or sports. Because most of them are, not well written, low production value. Generally, I'm watching American-produced stuff or British-produced stuff just because they make better stuff. And I'm not sure throwing more red tape at the problem is going to solve the fundamental issue, which is with an abundance of media out there, people are voting with their feet and eyeballs on this one.
Well, and there's the flip side of the issue where the film industry is thriving in Metro Van. I can't walk downtown without running across 2 or 3 film sets. I mean, you have big budget TV shows filming here every day. Most of the DC series, all those superhero shows are filmed in Vancouver. Supernatural is still doing great in Vancouver. But you don't watch these sort of big budget films portraying themselves as Vancouver. Vancouver never plays itself. Canada, the only shows about Canada are those quirky CBC comedies that no one really likes or you'll watch because you feel like you have to. Where's the superhero that lives in Vancouver? Or where's the story about the cops in Toronto? Those stories exist. They're out there. Why not set something in Canada? Maybe we're just too boring of a country. And the flip side of this sort of investigation and the survey is looking at these sort of moonshot ideas, sort of testing the waters for what people feel about driverless cars, for what they feel about unmanned aircrafts and drones delivering packages, and the Google's Project Loon as space balloons connecting internet to the remote areas, something that could actually give internet to most of Canada, to be honest. We're a very sparse country where no one's going to put telecom towers across Nunavut.
Yeah, for a lot of the country, you kind of have, at least geographically speaking, you kind of have to use the satellite internet, which isn't the greatest.
And costs a lot. And then there's this sort of weird issue of airport and seaport privatization, which, unsurprisingly, the response was lukewarm, because I think even the most staunch free marketer might stop for a second. Maybe not the most staunch, but, the sort of centrist, conservative thinks there's some good reasons we sort of regulate airports.
At least with the airports, a lot of European airports are privatized, and the European airline industry generally works pretty well. And I tend not to be much of an opponent of privatization just in principle. It's kind of really a case-by-case thing, and this is one of those situations where I'm not sure there's a compelling case. Usually the compelling cases for privatization is where you can really kind of harness the market forces to use competition to drive down prices and increase quality. That's not really the case with something like an airport or a seaport, which is fairly close to a natural monopoly. I mean, I suppose if the Port of Metro Vancouver really hiked its berthing fees up, ships could go up to Prince Rupert, but for a lot of practical purposes, these are natural monopolies. So you're not having entrepreneurial airports trying to set up a landing strip for 737s. Yeah, exactly. That's the issue, is that you might see a little more competition, and the Abbotsford Airport might get a little more business, but generally it's a little harder to really get a lot of benefits out of these privatizations. There's, I think, good questions on why governments run retail operations like the liquor stores that a lot of provinces have. And, BC, we have private liquor stores, so it's not much of an issue. But, Ontario, it's all government run, except for the beer store, which is a government-granted monopoly to a private company. It's weird. But the point is, like, the LCBO, obvious thing to privatize if you're going to be going the privatization route and looking for something privatized. Stuff like airports, seaports, and Hydro One, that's less compelling a case.
Well, federal government doesn't have the option to privatize LCBO.
I'm using that more as an example of something that would make sense to privatize. But yeah, most of the things that would have made sense for the federal government to do kind of got done in the Mulroney era. Air Canada, Petro-Canada, none of those make it. They're competitive markets more or less. Airlines are kind of borderline on that one, but there's at least arguments on both of those where they're competitive markets. But the air and seaports, I'm just really not sold on the privatization case on those.
Well, it'll be interesting to see which of these sort of test balloons make it to the budget or in the future, and whether that generates more of a reaction than a lukewarm sort of response they seem to have gotten to these. Well, speaking of regulations, the city of Richmond had a council meeting where they had been advised by their sort of policy staff and the bureaucrats to put some regulations around short-term rentals, basically Airbnbs. And then the council went, no, we'll just ban them outright. No one can short-term lease their property anymore in the city of Richmond. And no one really knows what that means yet. And
especially just the enforcement mechanisms have yet to be determined.
Yeah, so there's this big question now in Richmond about how they will find them and shut them down.
Yeah, the Airbnb thing's definitely been one of those issues that have kind of constantly reared its head as the housing crisis continues. But this does seem to be a bit of an overreaction on their part. And while there are some concerns about Airbnb, most of them are a function of the other problems with the market, and they more just highlight the issue rather than being a causal part of it that most people associate with it. Yeah, are we going to have City of Richmond staff just browse Airbnb every day to see what if anything gets listed in Richmond and then go try and bust it? So yeah, just the general problems with this isn't that people are putting in generally somewhat underutilized asset on the market. It's the fact that the asset itself is too scarce in the market. And while this may help a bit, it just doesn't seem to be a really long-term solution, especially as more and more of these services keep popping up.
Yeah, I don't see many other municipalities going this route. This is a very sort of extreme way that Richmond went. But who knows? Maybe they'll set the precedent, and this will be the end of Airbnb.
Well, there's definitely been pressure in Vancouver to adopt similar approaches, but like I said, it's definitely more on the extreme side, and I think you're not likely to see it as such a unanimous one, especially when there are other benefits to having it there. I could see what very patchwork approach over the metro area going forward with this.
Well, finally, let's touch on a couple bits of nomination news that are maybe a bit more noteworthy. We won't touch on every single nomination throughout the province as it comes up to the election, because that would be too many. But I think the biggest news this last week was Bryce Cassavant has announced he's basically going to be the NDP's candidate against Andrew Weaver. Bryce is better known as the bear rescuer, or even the bear savior, who a few years ago was suspended by the BC Conservation Office when he refused to euthanize 2 orphan baby bears, and he became sort of internationally famous for saving these baby bears who had their mother euthanized because she'd been becoming too friendly with people, which is a thing that happens, unfortunately. Cassavant had been looking to secure the nomination in Comox Valley seat next door where the Liberal MLA is retiring, and so it'll be an interesting battle there. But there were 3 other candidates running for it, and I guess he wanted a good fight. This is really interesting because Andrew Weaver is the only Green MLA with a seat and the leader, and overall pretty popular and reasonable guy. And here you have the NDP lining up someone with a decent amount of star power. There'll obviously be Green members who are really offended by this and think the NDP should just take a step back and let Andrew walk in. But I think it's good to have these contests, this is democracy. This is seeing who's the best candidate and who the people of Oak Bay want to be their MLA.
Yeah, exactly. Uncompetitive elections aren't good for anyone, including party leaders. Generally hard to unseat them, but, a small party like the Green Party, it might happen, and it's definitely one to keep an eye on that we'll be watching for when the returns come in on Election Day.
The other bit of news is Vicky Huntington, who's the longtime independent MLA from Delta, has decided that she's finally going to retire. Huntington's very popular in her riding. You have to be an independent who sticks around for that long. But that opens up an interesting battle in that seat because it's sort of right in the Metro Vancouver, but it's maybe a bit more to the suburbs where the Liberals might do a little bit better.
And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. If you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.